Good morning. It's a joy to be with you all this morning, and I bring you greetings from your brothers and sisters down at St. Luke's in Evanston, where I normally worship on Sundays. My father grew up a couple of blocks from here up on Roslyn Road, and when I run through the neighborhood and come past this church, I always see so much life going on and so many people coming and going, and now I see why. Here you are. We come together on a day like this with, I hope, some sadness in our hearts and commiseration with those who have lost their lives recently in Paris and for those who mourn. We have no idea, of course, nor do we wish to have any idea of what is in the hearts or minds of those who act in such a violent way. And it's easy, of course, very quickly to put them in a kind of inscrutable camp of evil people that we don't know anything about. But the gospel tells us, not just this morning, but morning by morning, every time we open it, that things are much more complicated than that. Because we all know that we each can harbor within ourselves a great deal of anger, and we often do tend to exclude people who are frightening or different from us. Sometimes we even can put away and silence parts of our own selves that seem disturbing or upsetting to us, keep them quiet. Jesus is facing a moment when the temple, the place of ritual sacrifice, of ritual encounter with God, is going to very shortly after his death be destroyed. And his early followers understood him to become, in a sense, the new place, the new temple, the new living temple, within which they could encounter the true and living God. But in all religions, including our own, in Judaism and Islam and Christianity and in every other that I've ever run across, there is a natural human instinct to think about God very much as a projection of our own selves. And that God, who is a very fierce and demanding idol, always requires a great deal of sacrifice. If you were from a priestly family in the ancient world, no matter where you lived, you'd probably grow up like this young man here, being prepared to offer sacrifices. It would have been your job as a member of the priestly family to go out and to divine, literally, to figure out what it is that the local God would require in order for things to go more or less well for your people. Maybe it would be a cereal or a grain offering, or maybe it would be a certain number of animals. And we know, alas, that in the ancient world often human sacrifice, often child sacrifice was made. Early followers of the young man that we know, Jesus, would have grown up with that in their understanding, and indeed the temple in Jerusalem was the place in which ritual sacrifice was offered. The deep understanding that God would somehow require a certain amount of something from us in order to be willing to do what we needed is ingrained in fallen human imagination. I don't know why that is. Why is it that we somehow need to think that good things only ever come at a terrible cost? Maybe that's something to do with what we call the fall, with our experience of trying to seize for ourselves, as the story of the garden in Eden tells us, seize for ourselves something that God was freely offering, but which the serpent, our enemy, tried to suggest to us God was somehow holding back from us, and being a stingy old son of a gun wasn't going to let us have any of it, and wanted to keep us from growing up and becoming wise and proficient and adults. And so we seized something which, of course, would have always been offered. Everything in Eden was a moment of communion with this God who gives us our lives, our livelihood, and everything, all gift. If one of you were to invite me over to your house for Thanksgiving in a couple of weeks, why, you'd have probably been preparing all kinds of wonderful things. I've no doubt you may be already busy doing that. And away in the kitchen would be ranks and ranks of pies, all perfectly prepared, And there I'd come, and you'd be thinking about all these things as sort of signs and the very substance of our having fun together, of our being friends together, a way of communicating with each other over a great meal. But what if I were to sneak into your kitchen soon after you let me through your front door and scrabble away into a corner and devour hunks of pumpkin pie off by myself, just snarfing it down because I guess I was hungry or greedy or fearful that you wouldn't let me have enough? Well, the whole party would be spoiled. Thanksgiving would be hurt in a sense. The gifts which were meant to be signs of communion, freely given, freely shared out with each other, have become little shrunken possessions of mine, furiously eaten off in a corner like my dog would do. She did once, and that was a very bad Thanksgiving. We know that that's a temptation. We live in a world which has a great deal of scarcity. Sometimes it's scarcity of resources. Sometimes it's scarcity of acceptance. And we crave all these things, and we fear that there's a kind of zero-sum game that we're part of, and that if someone else has something, that means we don't. We know that ideology is rampant in the Middle East. There's a sense that some people in the West have taken something from other people, and it has to be won back. And the trouble is, in all these cases, we assume that the God who supports us and affirms our own righteousness over against these bad people, these evil people who we want to get rid of, whom God commands the death of so that we can be right with God. We know that that mindset is always possible. Think of all the stories in the Old Testament where the great leaders of our faith, our forebears, thought that God was commanding them a terrible sacrifice. The most famous of those stories being when God has to interrupt Abraham from offering his own child. And Abraham heard this as a test. It's hard to know what to make of that story. In our own country, you know that people who are different from us have often been scapegoated in that way. In the years after the Civil War, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people of color, people who were different, Catholics, Jews, also Hispanic people, were lynched. Even today, as we've just been seeing all around our country, people of color feel not welcomed. And there's a way in which the God who supports each side reflects that fear and demands a kind of punishing sacrifice to be offered. That's what scapegoating is. On the 4th of March in 1865, Abraham Lincoln, as you know, stood in Washington and said these words in his second inaugural. I printed them out this morning because I wanted to make sure it was exactly what he'd said. He said 1/8 at the beginning of the Civil War, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Neither party expected the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Each side looked for an easier triumph, and as a result, less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayer of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully, said Lincoln. Now, the trouble with these punitive, sacrifice-demanding gods is that we can keep them under control when we institute a kind of religious outlet for that need to offer a scapegoat. We can turn religions into scapegoating mechanisms which succeed very well in keeping the peace. We have these bad people over there, and we take some of them and we do something terrible to them, and that becomes part of the whole ritual process by which we are affirmed and our God is satisfied. It's a horrible thought, but that seems to be the way much of the ancient world understood sacrifice. And alas, we can see the ways in which it is not so far beneath the surface of our own history. And we often treat each other that way in much more minimal and less bloody kinds of fashions. Think of how people can shun one another, or how people can turn away in anger from some part of their own lives, or some member of their own family. But when these people who met Jesus and followed him, spent time with him, when the disciples gathered round and got to know him, they felt in him a different way of thinking, a different way of understanding. It was as if Jesus was filled and galvanized with a sense that an immense, generous abundance was always with him, always filling him, always drawing him forward. And out of that peaceful abundance, he was with people. Think of all the people who must have come to talk to Jesus who we don't even hear about in the pages of the Gospels. Young people and old people, sick people and healthy people, all feeling somehow in him someone who could understand them more profoundly than anyone ever had, who could hear the fears that they genuinely carried, the angers, the sense of frustration, who could mediate to them some amazing sense of his own confidence in that abundant giver of life who sent him to us. Over the centuries, hundreds and thousands of men and women have gotten to know Jesus in that way. We practice that sense of his generous, self-giving life in every Eucharist. That's what we make the sign of, not so that it can just be kept here at the altar, but so that we can begin to see that generous, abundant, giving God present, giving himself away to us over and over in every moment of our lives. Think about what that would be like, to think about the reality of God who's not waiting for you to make a sacrifice of some kind, to be good in some way, to do some kind of act in order to forgive or love you, but whose loving forgiveness of you is what inspires and sets you free to act that way, whose generous heart is the very source of your own actions of courage and compassion for others, who overcomes the divide and breaks down the division between people who mistrust each other and are afraid of each other, who breaks down the walls even within ourselves, between the parts of ourselves that we think are acceptable and decent and offerable to God and the parts that we keep hidden and locked away. That generous love which animates Jesus is the very life of this church, of every Christian community. It's the true heart of every encounter with God that we can have. So this day, when we receive the Eucharist, or when we reflect on that moment later today, perhaps we take a few moments and just ask God to show us the places in our own lives that are most intensely real. Where are the places that you are most fearful, angriest, most hopeful, most longing, most passionate? Those places which are the true heart of you, hold them out to God. Hold them out to Christ, and let him fill them with his truth and abundance. Let him open up within his own heart that generous, flowing heart of God from which he comes and which is made visible to us on the cross. The cross we speak of, using the old metaphorical language that we inherit, we speak of it as a sacrifice. But it isn't the sacrifice that a punitive, angry, wrathful God demands of us. It is simply what an evil and broken down world does to a human being who loved us and loved his own to the end. We're the ones who sacrificed Jesus. The Father sends him to us in love. And the Father's vindication that everything Jesus said and did, all that he meant to us, all that he speaks to us now through his Spirit, the Father's affirmation that the truth about himself is what is spoken in Jesus of Nazareth, his love, his compassion, his unstinting generosity, is the raising of Jesus from the dead. The authorities had put Jesus to death. They had said he was an evil man who had to be excluded and isolated. Caiaphas in John's gospel even said perhaps he will be an offering, and instead of the whole nation being punished, we'll offer him as a sacrifice, and the Romans will be our sacrificial instrument by which we'll get rid of this guy, this bad guy. But on the third day, the generous, loving one who sent him to us sends him to us again, crucified and yet inexhaustibly alive, filled with the generous truth of God. Place yourself in that open heart, that open side that Jesus makes known to us. Let him beat in your heart with his heart. Let him set you free. And pray for all those in every place, including in our own country, who fear others, who are gripped by anger and hatred, who project onto God a demand for punishment and sacrifice rather than an infinite capacity for reconciliation and transformation.